Hello everyone, hope you're all well and thanks very much for all the support with my videos. I'm very grateful. Thanks for likes, shares, comments, and thanks to everybody who's pressed subscribe to my YouTube channel and also everybody who's supporting me through Buy Me a Coffee. I'm very grateful. Today I want to speak about Sinn Féin's immigration policy that was announced with much fanfare over the last number of days. It claimed to be a significant intervention in the immigration chaos in Ireland. This comes on the back of huge amounts of protests over the last year, in particular the last number of months. We've seen recently the huge protests being held in Coolock about the repurposing of the ex-Crown Paints factory site to be used for the international protection system. And also we've seen protests in Dundrum, recently in Dundalk and County Louth also as well. So we've seen a huge amount of issues, and the vast majority of people in polls have said there should be limits placed on the amount of migrants, and many people have said it has just gone out of control. We've seen the immigration chaos benefit so many people in society, benefit the rich, benefit the big employers, but of course this significant intervention from Sinn Féin doesn't mention any about benefiting the big employers. It's stated by Mary Lou McDonald within this policy to say they will work with communities and they will only locate in centres with areas where there is capacity and services. And also it stated that they will create a standardised, transparent and consistent approach which is open for submissions. Now let's go into this in a little bit of detail, because they said it's going to be open for submissions, but there's no veto being offered by people or communities. They said it should follow the same processes which are currently in place with the planning system. So basically with the planning system you can make an observation submission and then it's decided upon by the planning officer in the local authority. But of course we've seen over the last number of years, we've seen the change in the legislation, for instance, and no permission being available or looked for or sought in the move towards international protection systems, and that's been pushed by Darragh O'Brien, the Minister for Housing. We've seen a lot of places that are completely ill-fit for purpose to be used for international protection, and so many people profiting from it. And it's also interesting to note in terms of the Coolock issue that the previous owner has applied for permission on numerous times for planning permission, for apartments, for hotels, for creches, for other facilities, and it was refused because it was zoned for employment and enterprise, which is Z6 zoning again. But again, this can be used for international protection without any recourse by the community to make submissions, observations, objections and so forth as well. And it was interesting as well in the context of this, because there are issues regarding concerns regarding asbestos and a lot of other concerns regarding this proposed accommodation facility. Now, the interesting thing about this is to say it will work with communities, but again, the issue is, according to Mary Lou McDonald, that people are listened to, people are heard, which I fully agree with, but the bit I totally disagree with is the fact that people are central to the decision-making process. So what about the citizens of the country? What about the community sovereignty in terms of this? It seems to have gone out the window. So it seems that they will push through the policy regardless, to say there's no veto and there's no community sovereignty, and they will listen, they will hear people, but they will push ahead with these policies. And they also said they will put them in places where there is resources available, rather than looking at the areas where they're currently sitting to try and facilitate proper resources in areas of working class communities, which has completely been smashed for generations, and in particular since the financial crash. But of course this won't be addressed because of lack of services, such as lack of access to housing, healthcare, and basic education services as well, and basic facilities for people in working class communities such as clubs and sporting facilities also as well. But it's interesting that they also said they will end the profiteering and only locate state-run centres. So is this a new incarceration facilities you want to create? So is there any change to this policy? I don't think so. It's just moving around the chairs and a Titanic to seem like they're doing something, but we'll still push through on this regardless on their policies for the bosses in Brussels, for their bosses in these technocratic, bureaucratic institutions, rather than the interests of ordinary people. And where's the democratic will of the people? Is it being acknowledged? Is it being respected? Is it being heard? Is it central to the decision-making process? I would argue it's not, because if it was, people would be consulted on what's going on in their communities. And this is in particular very important to note in a country that is exceptionally wealthy in terms of the top 1% of the population have nearly up to 40% of the wealth. When we consider 2 billionaires have the same wealth as the bottom 50% of the population, it shows you the huge inequality that currently exists in our society. So putting more centres isn't a solution. Creating more centres and more state-run centres is creating more incarceration facilities rather than having a system and community sovereignty where people are based on what people need. And again, the issue has always been conflated about immigration, because it's always said that it's people who have contributed to society, which there is no doubt there has been contributions to society, but at the same time, who's benefiting? Why isn't there penalties on big bosses for exploiting cheap labour? But of course, this is part of a bigger plan to force in lower wages, to work towards the pension scheme, and a lot of stuff that's been driven by the elites at the top of society rather than serving the interests of ordinary people. So it shows what's really happening in society. It uncovers really who the political establishment represent. Rather than the interests of ordinary people, they represent the interests of the big bosses, the super rich, the wealthy, the corporations. Who they benefit. And this is not the same as to say that they're trying to be seen to do something, but really, as I said, not doing very much when the horse is very much bolted on this event as well. But the critical component of this, and what people should be challenged on and what politicians should be challenged on, is the whole idea of community sovereignty. And when you consider the location of many of these centres in working class communities, the issues about lack of services, lack of resources are huge issues. And then when they circumvent the planning process, and there's people in wealthier areas who have access to resources, will log and clog up the courts for years and years with their objections, will be able to have the funds and the means and the wherewithal and the access to those services and resources in their community, because many are part of the ruling classes and very linked in to the ruling classes, because they can link into the professional classes and will block a lot of stuff which goes against their interests, because they'll say not on our doorstep, and it's not seen as being, they're not smeared for it, they're not targeted, they're not cancelled or called names. But this is again part of the grandstand, the political grandstanding rather, from Sinn Fein, rather than doing that with any substantive issue regarding the policy of the state. And it fundamentally comes down to the control of the policy of the state down to the people in terms of where the policy should be derived from, which is fundamentally stated in Article 6 of the Irish Constitution, Bun Rock na Héireann. So it is very important that people start realising our own strength, realising what power we should have in a society. And if you have politicians to represent them, you need politicians who are listen, hear people, but also bring power back to our communities where people have a say in what goes on in our lives in terms of what access or what services we need in our communities, such as a right to a home, a decent health service, a dignified existence and decent employment. And why isn't there targeting, for instance, of these big employers who exploit workers at will, who force in a lot of low pay, low cheap labour? Why isn't there penalties? Of course, there was no mention of this in Sinn Féin's immigration plan, or many of the opposition parties don't even talk about this, which is a critical